Good morning. Please turn with me to Psalm 99. Psalm 99 as we look at the subject this morning, Zion. Zion. For multiple reasons. One, because it literally comes up in Psalm 99, but it's going to come up 3 times in Psalm 102. But more importantly, it's kind of a pun this morning because a young man, we're going back to sports analogies, because our brother relieved us of sports analogies this morning in the class where he drew on Harry Potter and all kinds of other things. But it's me. And there's no need to pretend. I don't have a whole lot other ready, especially since the name Zion, a big famous athlete, is in the title. And so the pun comes in this. Zion Williamson is a very famous pro basketball player. And he is a young man who I started being fanned up on him just because his parents named him Zion. I was like, there's got to be some Jesus in that somewhere. And I think it might be because I saw some things in the character of this young man over the last couple of weeks that first had me kind of joining in the herd of keyboard warriors, telling this young man how he needed to improve to get to where he needed to be in his basketball career, which of course is going to be much greater, even if it ends tomorrow, than mine ever was. But it didn't prevent me from having my own opinion. See, because Zion Williamson was a young man who men like Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal have commented on, because they are great athletes who had weight trouble over the course of their careers. And it wasn't just from an aesthetic point of view, it was their ability to celebrate a little bit too much during this time of year was getting in the way of them reaching their potential. And so in this young man, Zion Williamson, he has reached a point in his career where his health every season is a problem because he has not found a way to keep his weight under control. And so we said beyond the aesthetic, this young man is having to deal with the pressure of criticism. See, because even folks like me, never words, are now on his case. Because as I heard another preacher by the name of J.D. Greer say not too long ago, we have become a society to our discredit that too often finds our self-esteem in tearing down the esteem of others. And so as I saw this young man, Zion Williamson, going through that this week, sometimes it's easy to dismiss the criticism when it doesn't fit. Oh, but when, like we said before, when I've done things that make it legitimate, it drives me to 2 places. One, either to just push up such a wall that I shut out all the legitimacy and the criticism such that I simply stay in a place where I really do need to improve. Oh, but the other temptation is to take so much of the criticism to heart that I'm just overwhelmed with what it is that I need to fix. And the thing that I saw here in chapter 99 goes beyond just the fact that this young man's name comes up in this chapter in verse 2. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. There was another concept that came up, and that was the concept of holiness that we'll see in verse 3. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. It's not the last time it's going to come up. Verse 5. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool. Holy is he. And then in the last verse, it's going to come up twice. Verse 9. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain. For the Lord our God is holy. And I got to confess, the whole concept of holiness is one that I actually find offensive sometimes. I find it offensive because it's one of those things that is outside of my reach. And as a man, I don't like stuff I can't get done. We've talked about it before. Part of manhood, of my feeling strong in my manhood, is all the stuff that I can accomplish. The word holy is one that immediately exposes the concept of stuff I can't do. And so it immediately provokes in me, as being honest, even as a quote-unquote preacher, quote-unquote, supposed to try to be holy. That's not the first response it provokes in me. The first response it provokes is me confronting the fact that there's a lot that I cannot do. So it makes me feel vulnerable. Beyond that vulnerability, it just kind of makes me mad. Well, God, if I can't be holy, why'd you make me this way? I think I've heard Paul talk about that. If it's so difficult for us to do this, why did he make us this way? And he says, will the potter or the pot find fault with the potter? And that's exactly what I do at times when I think of this whole concept of holiness. See, it reminds me of the ways in which I'm incomplete. And then it takes me back to that concept of Zion. See, because no matter how talented that young man is, what people have found out, even the simplest of folks, is there is this piece to his talent that is missing, that is keeping him from reaching his potential. And that's the struggle this young man is going through. See, if even as an older man, the whole concept of holiness makes me a little bit, I don't even have a word for it. Bitter, I don't know. Vulnerable, as we've already said. Find a word for it. How does it make you feel? Beyond manhood. How does it make you feel when people expose parts of your game that are lacking? That's not just a man thing. And that's what this young man's going through right now. And so once I stopped typing in all my advice to him, started realizing his perspective a little bit more. And so the advice that I was hearing from these men like Charles Barkley and Shaq, the parts I appreciated about the advice the most was the part where they said, this was my struggle too. And so those other pro athletes who didn't have the same struggle, they started to realize, you know what, I really like what Charles and Shaq said, because what they've said is, we've been through this. And so I'm not coming from a perspective of condescension. I'm coming from a perspective of one who has overcome. That reminds me of those 7 letters written to those 7 churches in the Revelation, when Jesus simply says, to this church write. See, there were only 2 of those churches, as we mentioned, who weren't rebuked for anything whatsoever, right? But they still had something to endure. And that was the temptation, I'm just going to say implicitly, to give up. Because even if you've gotten everything right, you're living in an environment that is going to pressure you and tempt you to give up. And no matter how perfect we might get it, no matter how perfect Mr. Williamson, Zion Williamson gets it, he is still going to be perfect in an environment that is still going to find flaws, whether they are there or not. That's the reality that we all live in. And so when we realize that beyond that concept of me being made to feel vulnerable, because there are spaces in me that need fixing, even if I get them fixed, I've set my expectations in the wrong place to the degree I believe that fixing me is going to fix everything. Because he's put us in difficult environments. And no matter how perfect we are, the next challenge is learning how to live in difficult spaces. Why? Because the next challenge Mr. Zion Williamson had was I remembered the next challenge that Mr. Zion Williamson had when I read forward in Psalm 102. Psalm 102, verse 8, where it says, all the day my enemies taunt me, and those who deride me use my name for a curse. We remembered the times when David himself talked about how he became the subject of the songs of the drunkards, and we took it back a little bit more and said how it seems like divine wisdom put the Psalms right after Job, because Job was one who said, even the drunkards are making songs about me. And so we have the psalmist, as we've said it before, it's the same thing. You'll come to some places in life where no matter how excellent you are at something, people who aren't accomplished in that area or maybe in their lives in any way at all will be able to look at the void in your life and make you the subject of their song. And that's the other thing we have to learn to contend with. This young man, once again, who has become exceptional, now has people fixating for 2 weeks on the one part of his life that ain't perfect. And now, as the scripture says, all the day my enemies taunt me. You know how the news cycle works? In order to keep your attention, they got to find something that'll make you click. And so this concept of all the day, I think that's something we can relate to now. When no matter how well you've done, it's the concept that some people talk about all the time. We love to build our heroes up only to tear them down. And just as in the day of my good press clippings, I heard somebody who was talking about this kind of period of this young man's life. I don't know if they were talking about him or another person who was going through a similar thing. They said you have to understand in terms of fame and in life in general how to try to be even keeled. Why? Because if you fall too much for the praise, then the criticism is probably going to have an exaggerated effect on you when the praise turns to criticism. Oh my goodness. I remember listening to a song this morning. Reminds me. I can't remember exactly what the lyrics are, but it talks about how ultimately all I need is you, Jesus. All I need is you. And see, if I look at it from one perspective, I'll be like, oh, mama, no, you need me too. You need me too. But ultimately, I don't know whether I'm going to be there tomorrow. And even if I am there, sometimes my presence can just be an irritant. And at the end of the day, that song helps us remember that the only one we can really trust consistently, whether it's applause or boos, is the one who sees us consistently for what we really are. We've talked about it before, the difference between self-esteem and God-esteem gives us the ability to stay even-keeled regardless of whether we're receiving praise we don't deserve or boos that we really don't need. And so to the degree we can appreciate the people that God has given us during this time of year, where we say thanks for Christ. Like we said, even if we don't know his birthday or date, this is the time we say thank you for simply being born and willing to spend time with us. See, it's one thing when I'm in my mindset, Zion Williamson, Rookie of the Year, of course you want to be around me. But it's another thing when life brings me back to a place where I realize no matter how famous I get, no matter how well I do, there's still some parts of me that will make everyone want to run away. And in this time when we celebrate Christmas, we're celebrating a God who still wants to be there when nobody else does. And that's what this young man, Zion Williamson, is learning. He's learning the value of the people who are willing to stay, even when everybody else is willing to leave, no matter how many millions he can count in the bank account. Oh, there are a lot of other famous people with millions. We can go congregate around them now. They're more popular than you are. You're trending down, bud. The other millionaires are, well, even if they ain't trending up, they're just not trending down. So even for the rich and famous, there is a lesson in having the stability that says God is there regardless of what you're trending. As long as you're willing to endure the rest of what he calls us to in this passage. Why? Because he says in verses 9 and 10, for I eat ashes like bread of Psalm 102 and mingle tears with my drink because of your indignation and anger. For you have taken me up and thrown me down. We've talked about it before. It's one thing when it comes from people. Oh, wait, he's talking about God. Marcus, how are you talking about how God will always be there? He's throwing this guy up and down. Seems like some of this is coming from God. Well, we talked about it before. It's motive. It's motive. See, if God was throwing me down just to cast me away, yeah, that'd be a pretty good reason for despair. But ultimately, if I begin to trust the reasons why God is casting me down, then it's easy for me to say, though he slay me, Job, once again, I don't think it's a coincidence that Job comes before the Psalms, where we see David going through a similar struggle. Though he slay me, I will still trust in him. See, it's easy to say, but it's tough to do when you're there. When you realize it's not just the critics. Oh, wait a minute. It is him. Ouch. And so ultimately, the thing that can help, I believe, help this young man Zion, help us overcome those times when it really is the criticism. It's coming through people, but it is something that if we really got on our knees and asked God, it's something that, the hard truth is God would say that we need to make that change too. Part of the thing that he can help us overcome or help use, part of the things that God can help use to help us overcome is beyond saying, yes, this really is you, bud. Understanding that sometimes as old people, even as the Barclays in our lives, or the Shaqs, Shaquille O'Neals, often criticism, one of the ironies was getting to hear that young man respond to the criticism. See, because what happened was they stuck a mic in his face after one of their games, after he got to hear all the criticism. I didn't know what I thought about that young man, but my perspective on him began to change again when I heard him listen to one of the reporters ask him, okay, did you hear what Charles and Shaq said about you? It's like, well, no, I didn't. What'd they say? They said, blah, 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 blah. And they go with the quote. And the young man simply responded, to the degree they mean well, thank you. But to the degree they don't, I can't control what another grown man thinks. Ow! I'm sorry I'm yelling. Because that to me is the foundation of a young man, regardless of his problems, he's ready to boss. He's ready to grow. And he is ready to do the kinds of things that when God casts him down, he understands why. See, he's not casting aside the critics because he realizes that even his critics have a role in his growth. And beyond that, he can realize that just as vulnerable and human as he is in this moment, if he waited to hear Charles and Shaq's response to his response, and I'm getting a little confused now, I got to follow up and hear what Mr. Barkley and Mr. O'Neal said in response. Oh, well, did you hear what Zion said in response to you? And Ernie Johnson, the mediator of Inside the NBA, said, da-da-da-da-da. This is the quote. And the ironic thing was these men who had offered up this insightful criticism to this young man, they couldn't even take his thanks because it seemed to basically lay out two alternatives. See, if you really do mean well, I really do mean thanks. But if you don't, you fill in the blank. And as I sat and watched both Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal get offended by a qualified thanks, I began to realize that sometimes as old folks, we do a better job of giving the criticism than we do in taking it. And that is where that young man can also begin to heal. Because just as he's got some things he needs to improve, no matter where we come from at our best, no matter how lovingly we give the advice, sometimes we have to realize that we aren't always as great at taking the counsel as we are at giving it. Amen. And so in this time of year where this young man is facing Christmas probably at a lower point than he might have ever been during his career, Zion Williamson may never hear me speak a word, but understand the way in which this young man struggled, whether he ever meets any of us, has probably given us an indication as to how we can, one, refocus our attitude towards that concept of holiness. See, because what holiness is a call to have us, as we say on the first day of the week, let a man or a person examine themselves and then take the bread and the cup. Holiness is a call that once I get past that uncomfortable feeling of realizing that I still have some stuff that I need to fix, that just as I look at Zion Williamson or any other person, like a Charles Barkley, and be like, okay, wait a minute, this young man on the rise in his career, he will never be what he's supposed to be if he can't get this one thing under control. But likewise, even in the midst of my success, there's another young man who's dealing with a lot of criticism right now, and his name is Draymond Green. Draymond Green is famous because you all know he plays for the best basketball team ever created. I'm sorry, the Golden State Warriors. Draymond Green has won his 4 championships. He hasn't had to struggle with the weight issues the way that Zion Williamson has. Why? Because he is one of those, what they call blue-collar, lunch pail players. He brings it to work. He's almost always in shape. He doesn't have any of the struggles that we see in this young man, Zion Williamson. See, but at the tail end of his career, after all of his hard work and his talent is paid off, Draymond Green is basically making those 4 championships an afterthought because he's flown above reproach in many ways for so long that he's now physically lashing out at people over and over again in a way that is beginning to have many in the league be like, maybe we're just better off without Draymond. And so now he's in a situation where no matter how many things he has complete, the fact that there's this one piece of him that's missing has the ability that even though he's gotten to places Zion might never get, as old people, we have the ability to erase it all if we are not as concerned about that whole concept of holiness as the young people who are trying to build on the front end. And so what I'm getting to see in Draymond Green is a player I'm a fan of, who is facing the very same dilemma that this young man Zion Williamson is, just from a different perspective. See, I can ruin it on my ascent because I don't have a proper commitment to holiness, and I can also ruin it in retrospect, or looking back, if I don't have a proper commitment to holiness. Why? Because just as we see, it's not just enough to be a 4-time champion. It's not just enough to be the young person that everybody's saying. We're debating whether or not it was Michael Jordan or whether it is LeBron, people who in your time of struggle would never offer the kind of praise, compliments, and accolades you might deserve. Sometimes circumstances will bring you to a place where they're honestly talking about what they really think about your potential. And the one thing I've seen in Zion Williamson this week is how all of these different people who debate whether or not the greatest is Michael Jordan or whether it's LeBron James, I have seen so many people crossing so many different opinions about who the greatest is, saying this young man was next. This young man was next. This was the greatest. And this is what's happening to him. He may never get there if he doesn't commit to holiness. Oh, they would never call it holiness, but that's literally what this chapter is talking about. When it's talking about holiness, it's talking about a concept that even the pagans realize, because they realize that without completeness, we can never reach our potential. And without completeness, no matter how many accolades we've received, we can ruin it all if we're not careful. And here's the thing, as we mentioned before, as we draw to a close, I never like to say that because, well, good luck. But understand, as we mentioned before, even if we realize whether we're on the ascent or just in those years where we're, God willing, trying to wind it down, no matter how perfectly we get it, we're still going to have to go back into an environment where during this Christmas season, the thing I've been reminded of is no matter how holy we are in our conduct, there are spaces in our lives that are still missing. As we talked about a little bit during the prayer request. See, holiness reminds us also that no matter how complete we are as people in our behavior and our conduct, this is a time of year that reminds us not everybody we love is here. And so there is, no matter how great we get individually, there's something that's missing. And understand that during those times when we realize that there is something that's missing, part of the value in having a Christ during this time of year reminds me that no matter how perfect I am, I'm just a part of you all's lives. I'm just a part of my mama's life. See, there's some people that we're all missing during this year if we think, or during this time of year if we think hard enough. And no matter how much of a blessing I'd like to be to each and every one of you, I'm only a piece. And that's what this time of year reminds us. It humbles us to realize that no matter how great a son or daughter we might be, I'm just a piece of what mom and dad need. No matter how great a brother or a sister I am, I'm just a piece of what mom and dad need. No matter how great a parent I am, I'm just a piece of what my child needs. And ultimately, holiness doesn't just talk about my conduct. It helps me appreciate the fact that no matter what I want to be or what I want to do for my loved one during this time of year, I need to also pray for them to overcome that which is missing in their lives. Whether it's just the ways that I can be better during the holiday season, or ways I can just help to be patient and pray and just be whatever I can be for people who are missing some things this time of year. Why is that important? Because even when we get those two things situated, final illustration that came to mind this time of year was I get a chance, beyond our brother who takes care of the building here, I get a chance to meet a lot of folks who take care of the facilities over at WSU. And one of the things, having worked a whole lot of different jobs, talked about the Buc-ee's principle before. One of the reasons why Buc-ee's is so famous in Texas is back in the time when folks at the rest stops between your trips on the highway, when they would cut corners on that whole concept of clean restrooms. Who has time to pay an extra janitor at a restaurant or facility where we're already stretched? We understand inflation right now. People are stretched, and they're talking about places where you cut budgets. We talked about the whole concept of Buc-ee's being one where the reason why their business exploded is because they invested in a place that everyone else was ignoring. And so when everybody else said, we're going to cut corners on whether our restrooms are kept clean, they invested in keeping clean restrooms. And now they are famous for people who are willing to drive and hold it just so we can get to a Buc-ee's. See, a few years ago when I started here, Buc-ee's was my only illustration of that principle. But now having been with you for a while, every time I go into a restroom over at WSU's campus, I know that that doesn't just happen on accident. Those restrooms are pristine. And one of the reasons why that stands out to me in a time like this is even in a situation where you get everything together, where you yourself have opened up to God and say, God, I'm no longer resisting or wincing at that thought of being holy. I just want you to make me holy because I know I can't do it on my own. Even when I get to a place where I know no matter how holy I am, I can never be all I would like to be for my family and friends. Even if we are able to pull it together, we are in an environment where we are going to go to work and live in a place where the environment's just unholy. Because one of the things I got to learn in talking to the brothers and sisters who take care of things over at WSU is no matter how excellent they become at their jobs, and I'm telling you, from a person who knows, they're excellent at what they do. There are people who take joy in making a mess of the very thing you become excellent in doing. And it's part of the reason why they are so essential. And that's the lesson, that's the world that we live in. Going back to the young man Zion, no matter how much he fixes, it allows God to make him holy. The last point we need to make scripturally, verse 16. Forgot 3 times the concept of Zion is literally going to come up in chapter 102. Let's back up to verse 13. You will arise and have pity on Zion. It is the time to favor her. Next it's going to come again in verse 16. For the Lord built up Zion. He appears in his glory. He regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer. And it's going to come up again in verse 21. That they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, and in Jerusalem his praise, when peoples gather together and kingdoms to worship the Lord. Understand, please don't miss out on that second sense in which Zion comes up in verse 16. For the Lord builds up Zion. Please help me understand how this all came together for me in Psalm 127. Psalm 127. Psalm 127. Where it reads in verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. For he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies at the gate. Understand how those two concepts come together for me? Unless the Lord builds the house, you can have as many children as you want. What environment are we bringing them into if the Lord has not established the peace? That's one of the things that David says over and over again. God, please establish my throne. God says, I will. If they are not brought into a place where God establishes them, then once again, it's never going to be enough to bring peace to that household. Why? Because ultimately, no matter how peaceful or perfected that household is, we're all going to operate in an environment where at some point we're going to throw up our hands and be like, God, what do we do next? Why? Because much like our brother goes to work in an environment where no matter how exceptional he is, he's going back into a place where people's joy sometimes is messing it up just so he has something to clean up. That's the environment that we live in. And so ultimately in this time of year, when we're saying thank you for the birth of Jesus, as we mentioned in the prayers beforehand, God willing, we will walk forward with what we call sober judgment during this Christmas season, understanding that no matter how perfectly or how much we open up our hearts to the concept of God perfecting us once again, no matter how much he may establish us in our own homes, understanding that over and over again, much like these Psalms call for things like justice. The reason why my brother, who spent so many years before he retired from WSU, came to mind is there are things likewise that God is calling us to do. There are things that he over and over in these Psalms is saying, justice is something that's more important than you might be able to imagine. There are times when it's really hard for me to impress upon people the depth of all the things that God is calling us to do in these Psalms because they're just not popular. And so just like this brother goes to an environment where people are really happy to mess up the things that he has taken care to clean up, there are situations in our life where the more and more we draw closer to God and the things that he's calling us to do to become complete, the stranger and stranger we're going to become to a world that takes pride in messing up the very things that we are trying to ask God to fix up in our character, in our lives, in our families. And that's sober judgment. So as that young man, Zion Williamson, realizes that no matter how much he puts to work the advice that he's getting and perfects his game, there's always going to be something else. There's always going to be something else to criticize. And no matter how much he perfects his legacy, that at the end of the day, he's perfecting a legacy that will still exist in a broken and fallen world. My prayer for him is my prayer for us. That as we go into Christmas tomorrow, that we ask God to help us appreciate the people that he has given us. That we help show our thanks by being a gift to the loved ones we have around us, so that we can help alleviate the pain of loss that sometimes folks feel during this time of year. At least give a person an opportunity to have this healthy distraction. No matter how much I'm missing, Lord, I thank God for you. I thank God for you being here, and I thank God for the example that I see in you. And until he makes me whole, I thank God for the fact that I've got you. And the gifts are great. But praise God for Jesus, and praise God for you until he heals what's hurting in me.